I said because, and then I thought to myself, you know what, we're really not even, as Christians, we're no longer followers of the Old Covenant, meaning the Old Testament, we're followers of the New Testament. So let me just make it through this and get to the New Testament, and then everything should be okay. So I got to the New Testament, and I started reading about Jesus. And what I read about Jesus, and the things that Jesus said, were basically the same things I had read all throughout the Old Testament when it comes to creed. Because in the Old Testament, it says over and over again that God is one. This is very emphatically stated over and over again in the New Testament. God is one. So when you get to the New Testament, Jesus basically says the same thing. When people would come to him and say, Master, tell me how I can enter into the kingdom. He said, follow the commandments. He said, I've done that. He said, okay, then sell everything you have and follow me. This was very clear what he said. Follow the commandments. Okay, you have done that. Sell everything and follow me. Another man came to him and said, good master, tell me how I may have eternal life. He said, why thou callest me good? For there's none good but one, that is God. And then he made a statement. And this I will refer to a little bit later. Jesus said in that whosoever shall obey the smallest of the commandments and teach others to do so, he shall be called the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall break the least of the commandments and shall teach others to do so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus also said when the disciples were debating about which commandment was the greatest, they went and asked Jesus. They were debating about the 10 commandments. They said, tell us which is the greatest commandment. He did not even quote any of the commandments. He said the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then these are the greatest commandments, and all the other ones hang on these two. So then I made it past the 4 canon Gospels, and I made it into the writings of Paul. And when I made it into the writings of Paul, my heartfelt feeling was not very long-lasting, needless to say. Because when you get to the writings of Paul, the entire message changes. Jesus taught that the way to salvation was through obeying the laws of God. This was the same message that is throughout the entire Bible, from beginning to end. The salvation lies in obeying the commands of life that God has given you. You obey God, therefore He will forgive you and admit you into paradise. This was the way the Bible taught it. Jesus taught the same thing. And then we get to Paul, and Paul writes a letter to the Galatians. And in this letter of Galatians, Paul rebukes the church at Galatia by saying to them, pretty much, if you translate the Greek, it says, "O foolish Galatians." He calls them fools. He says, and he calls them fools because he asked them, why have you become so trapped up in this law? Why have you become so trapped up in this law, which is a curse? And Paul equates the law with a curse. And he says that this law is cursed. Therefore, Jesus came to free us from this curse by taking the curse upon himself. And then Paul quotes a verse from the Old Testament where he says, "For surely everything that hangeth on a tree is cursed." Because even Paul himself in the New Testament says that the crucifixion was a stumbling block for the Jews. He says this thing, the crucifixion, is a stumbling block for the Jews. Because the Gentiles would go to the Jews and tell them that the way to salvation is to believe in the crucified Christ. And they would laugh at them. Because by the law of the Old Testament, anything that goes on a cross, anything that is hung on a tree is cursed by God. So this was the entire reason that when they were taking Jesus to see what to do with him, that they were continuing to say, "Crucify him." Because they were saying crucify him because they were telling them that if you want to discredit him, if you want to make him to be not who he says he is, and you want to prove that, then crucify him. Because if you can crucify him, he is not the Messiah. By our own book, if you can crucify him, he's not the Messiah. So this was why they said crucify him. And this, as Muslims, now we know that he was not crucified. Because by God's own law, he could not be crucified if he was the Messiah. And we believe him as the Messiah.